let's go over the purpose of the respiratory system. So what is the respiratory system? Well, this picture over here is showing us the respiratory system, and the purpose of the respiratory system is to obtain oxygen for the body and to get rid of carbon dioxide, right? So that is the main purpose. That is the main reason why we have the respiratory system. So we want oxygen, we want to bring oxygen into the blood, and we want to get rid of carbon dioxide, right? So it's very important. Now this picture here is showing us the anatomy of the respiratory system. So where does the respiratory system start, right? Well, it starts over here in the nose or in the mouth. So the nose is a better way to breathe because when the air comes in through the nose actually humidifies and warms the air. So it makes the air a little bit warmer, so it's not so cold, and it adds a little bit of moisture to the air. So you can also breathe through your mouth as well, but the nose is the main place that human beings breathe, right? Because we want to warm the air and humidify it. Now when the air goes down here, right, past the nose, it goes into the area called the pharynx. So the pharynx is basically like the very back of the throat, right? That's called the pharynx. Now it continues down past the larynx. So the larynx is basically where the vocal cords are. That's where when you speak, the sound that you make comes from the larynx. So the larynx is down here in the throat. And after the larynx, it goes down through this tube called the trachea. Now the trachea you can actually feel at the front of your neck. You can feel these cartilage rings at the front of your neck. So the trachea is basically like a stiff tube where the air goes down. And then it splits off into the right and the left side. So we have a right lung, right? Some of the air can go into the right lung, and some of the air can go into the left lung, right? So air goes into both. Now, at the bottom over here, right, we have something called the diaphragm, right? So this is called the diaphragm. The diaphragm is a very, very thin sheet of muscle, right? So the diaphragm is a very thin sheet of muscle at the very bottom of the lungs. So what is the purpose for the diaphragm? Well, the diaphragm is basically what causes air to go in and out of the lungs. When the diaphragm contracts, again, it's a muscle, so it contracts. When it contracts, it basically pulls the lungs down a little bit and kind of opens up the lungs, causes, kind of a vacuum-like effect inside the lungs, and so air gets sucked in. When the diaphragm relaxes, the lungs go back up and the air is kind of squeezed back out. So the air goes down into the lungs, right? The air goes down into the lungs, but where does it go exactly? How does oxygen get into the blood, and how does carbon dioxide leave the blood, right? Remember, we want to bring in oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. So how does that happen, right? So here's how it happens. So again, this is the trachea. Remember that tube? This is the trachea. And then the air can go down into either the right lung or the left lung, right? So air goes down into both. And then from each of these tubes, the tubes, keep branching out. You see how everywhere that you go, the air can follow two different paths. So maybe it could go over here, and then it could go over here, and they could go over here, and over here, right? So the air can go in all these different tiny, tiny tubes all over the place. Now these tubes eventually become microscopic. They become so small that you need a microscope in order to see them. So let's suppose the air goes all the way down, all the way until it gets to the end. So where does it end up, right? It ends up in these small places called alveoli. So alveoli are these air sacs. So it looks like a cluster of grapes. That's what they usually call them. So the air comes down and it decides to go over here, and it finally ends up inside the alveoli. So the alveoli is the final place where the air goes. Now let's take a closer look at the alveoli. this is another picture of the alveoli. So if you take a look, you can recognize those grape-like clusters, right? Remember, the alveoli is made up of a whole bunch of spheres that look like a bunch of grapes. So the air came from here, from this tube, and it went all the way down and ended up inside this alveoli. Now, why does it want to get to the alveoli? Because as you can see in this picture, the alveoli is surrounded by all of these blood vessels, right? You see the red and the blue, all of these are blood vessels. Now remember, the red is usually the arteries. Blue is usually the veins. Now in this case, probably it's the opposite. Usually when you have a blue vessel, it usually means that there's not very much oxygen. So this blood in the blue vessel is arriving, right? So it's coming in from the heart. And it starts going through the alveoli, right? And as it does so, it starts picking up oxygen. It starts picking up all of the oxygen that's inside of the alveoli. When it picks it up, right, in the diagram, they show it as a red color, right? So from blue, it turns into red, and then it goes into this blood vessel, and it goes back to the heart. So the blood is coming in from the blue vessel, right? It goes around these alveoli. It starts picking up oxygen, right? And then it heads into the red vessel, and then it goes back to the heart. So all of these tiny, tiny blood vessels are called capillaries. If you remember from our guided lesson, the capillaries are very, very tiny, thin-walled blood vessels. So you can see how many capillaries there are all over the place. So it's important that the capillaries are very thin so that the oxygen and carbon dioxide can go in and out. So the blood picks up the oxygen and it gets rid of the carbon dioxide.